Namaskar. Today is July 20th, Tuesday, and welcome to Daily Global Insight with Sri and Spree, episode 207. In global news, the United States, NATO, and the European Union to blame China for the cyber attack on Microsoft Exchange servers. US charges four Chinese nationals working with Chinese agency in global hacking campaign. All China can do is talk. Taiwan official dismisses Beijing threats after US military carriers landing in Taipei. US Defense Secretary Austin to visit Philippines, Vietnam, and Singapore as Washington seeks a coordinated approach to tackling Beijing in the South China Sea. Namaskar, Sridharji, and your thoughts on what is happening around the world.
Namaskar, good morning to everybody, and nice to be back on this wonderful Tuesday after a big sell off in markets, but we are making our way back. Now, coming back to the question, it's very clear. I think the Microsoft Exchange servers attack that one is alluding to relates to a whole breach that took place around emails, which hacked into small business, private, government, various agencies around the world. And I think everybody is now saying that it points to clearly the imprint and the hand of the Chinese. As far as your specific questions around South China Sea, what's happening around the South China Sea? I think Taiwan is saying it's all, fluster, and if they want to attack us, let's let them go ahead, and then we'll deal with the situation as is appropriate. What is also disconcerting is what has happened to Quad, because there's more and more attempts by Lloyd Austin as he visits the various countries such as Vietnam, Singapore, etc. It raises the questions, including Philippines. What has happened to a two-tier strategy where Quad is the overarching architecture for South China Sea security, and with the appropriate nations which form the various blocks, like South China block is ASEAN, then you have the Indian Ocean, then you have the Pacific, then you have the East China Sea. So it seems to have dissipated. There seems to be a complete reluctance or unwillingness on the part of Biden administration to come out, very clear with what is the story with Quad. Or they can say, look, we have revisited and we are adopting a much more segmented strategy. The segmented strategy, if it is to do with Indian Ocean, we bring India, France, and other people in. If we are dealing with South China Sea, which is a much more cluster of nations, then we bring a whole swag of European nations, NATO allies, and so on. Or if you're going into East China Sea, where there is this problem between Japan and Korea in terms of coordination, we may bring other nations in to look after, especially the Taiwan Strait, because Taiwan is the question. So there's no clear statement that is coming out from either from Kurt Campbell, who is supposed to be in charge, or from Antony Blinken. And then you have Lloyd Austin going and making these independent visits and trying to build a coordinated set of actions. We recall ASEAN was very comfortable with the Quad approach, which is to say US is back here. We have a set of four nations, led by Japan, Australia, India, besides US, to cover the security interests in the South China Sea. So this is what we continue to reaffirm, that there is clear ambiguity, barring this 1 billion vaccine effort which happened, when Biden assumed power. Everything seems to have dissipated as far as Quad is concerned.
And South Korea's Moon decides against a trip to Tokyo for Olympics as summit talks collapse. Both nations fail to narrow their differences. Japan considers reassigning diplomat after a gaffe in Korea. So South Korea, that is now essentially distancing itself from Japan. This is historic cultural things have been happening for a long time, but this seems to be a new low in the relationship. Your thoughts, sir?
I don't think there ever was a rapprochement on the broad Korea-Japan issues going back to World War II and the prior history of repression and so on and so forth. But I think that it was simmering, and now this new trilateral approach that Antony Blinken, Biden, Lloyd Austin trying to bring together, it seems to be not working. Which is, we need to get China, Japan, and US on this trilateral approach. But unfortunately, those discussions don't seem to be progressing well. And China, I think we covered this again in Daily Global. China is playing, Korea is playing a very soft and very clear and risk-free game, where it is saying on one side it'll deal with US, on the other side it doesn't want to antagonize China because of the huge border.
As coronavirus cases surge, public sentiments for conducting Olympics has soured and there is very little support. As a matter of fact, top sponsor Toyota pulls all Olympic TV ads in a blow to games. They will not be the last. Toyota officials have criticized the IOC, that is the International Olympic Committee, decision-making process and communications with sponsors. President Akio Toyoda will not be attending the Friday opening ceremony. Akio Toyoda is the president of Toyota Corporation. Sir, with Toyota now pulling out, this games appears to have taken a fairly big hit in terms of credibility.
There is, and public sentiments in Japan and specifically Tokyo seems to be moving against hosting the games in the middle of a big pandemic, which is affecting them. Now, hosting games with empty stadiums and with reluctance around crowd participation and sponsors, the prime sponsor Toyota unwilling to release ads doesn't augur well for neither the games nor for Japan itself as a hosting country, which seems to be a lame duck. I've also heard that at least 5 athletes have tested positive in the initial testing phase, and as things, the games are on this Friday. This is not the last. What exactly the repercussions are, we don't know. So this has been really a problematic area for Japan.
Has Beijing investments in the region won over Tibetans? The report by Nikkei contradicts the reality, with the Tibetan government in exile and is devoid of any democratic principles. Forced migration and the compulsive waving of red flags dominate the scene. Essentially, the PRC and its friendly media are trying to portray a picture as if all is well in Tibet and that the Tibetans have completely embraced the Chinese philosophy, but looks like that is not really the truth. Why is this painting over happening again, sir? We all know the truth.
Well, I think first and foremost, I think you have to commend Nikkei for sending a reporter. It was an orchestrated and managed navigation of the various areas, which Tibet is quite huge, various areas around Tibet, including the Buddhist University and so on. So there's good pictures and a good detailed article. But when you read through it, it's very clear that it's very orchestrated and everything is around one China, 70 years of integration of Tibet into mainland, and so on and so forth. But on the contrary, you have, one Tibet policy initiative from here. You have Tibetans being, lauded by India, Tibetan government in exile, Dalai Lama to be chosen and appointed by China rather than from the monastery. Etc. doesn't integrate very well, but nevertheless, it's a report that has come out. But it just tells you how different the reality is to what is being put out in public.
And Japan approves COVID antibody cocktail used to treat Trump. Delivered via one-time intravenous drip, the cocktail combines the monoclonal antibodies casirivimab and imdevimab, which bind to the surface of the virus to prevent replication. EU overtakes United States in first jab injections. EU now is at 55.7% versus 55.4% for the United States. So your thoughts on this medication that was given to Trump, which made him come back on his feet in like days?
Well, there seems to be some element of there was a controversy around why he was given and why others were not given. There was an emergency approval to Regeneron, which comprises of these compounds, antibody compounds. One is the monoclonal antibody compounds, which basically seems to be a much more effective mechanism to combat it, manufactured by Roche. Why it is the case, I mean, it begs the question. But what Japan has done is, look, it has worked there. So let me kind of bring that to bear and see whether it'll help right in the middle of an Olympics, right? So we'll leave for another day as to why this has been not approved formally, for a wide use across the world. Begs the question. But we leave it there. On the EU side, the percentage is very small, but EU wants to tout that its program of vaccination has advanced, notwithstanding the fact it has advanced. There's still a lot of resistance. You saw in France, you saw to some extent in UK, people resisting and coming to the streets and saying they're not taking vaccinations. The reason is we are hitting a hurdle rate of this 55%, for vaccinations both in United States and Europe, which is not very good given the advancement of Delta variant.
An Iran based Islamic leader terms withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan as a great victory for Muslim nations. Afghanistan removes its diplomats from Pakistan over kidnapping and torture of its envoy's daughter in Pakistan. Sir, look together. Why is Iran exulting over what is happening in Afghanistan? Afghanistan is, after all, Sunni, sir.
There seems to be a strategic alignment between strategic interests between Iran and Afghanistan. If you recall, Iran has indicated that it is willing and open to be negotiated to bring Taliban and the mainstream Afghan government from a negotiations point of view. There has been skirmishes around the Iranian border. There's also attempts by the Iranians to say that it will intervene. So, that's one aspect of this discussion. It's all geopolitical within the context of what's happening in Afghanistan. It's the center point of interest, not just for Iran, but Turkey, Russia, China, and so on and so forth. Of course, needless to say, the Pakistanis. In terms of the Afghan diplomats being removed from Pakistan, I think it's a telling sign that the moment the United States forces left, security seems to have lapsed in Pakistan, and the incident that happened was not very welcome, and just puts them in a bad light.
And now let's take a look at India news. Suzuki is going to be launching electric vehicles in 2025, and the Indian market will be the first one that it will be launching them in. India exported finished steel of 10.78 million tons in 2020-21 compared to 8.3 million tons in 2019 and 2020. Services sector's export may grow in fiscal year 22 by 10%, while it contracted by 3% in fiscal year 21. Fiscal year 21 sector volume was 205.27 billion. Domestic procurement and defense corridors are government programs to lift Made in India programs in the defense sector. And the Indian government allocates 71,438 crores for these programs. Export hubs face labor shortages as workers continue to stay away. So it looks like the problem that is plaguing the United States is also plaguing other countries.
Yes, indeed. I think most notably India. Taken in context in whole, it's great that Suzuki is using India. I mean, Tesla is also contemplating electronic vehicles, and Karnataka government is working hard to get its factory in Karnataka. Basically, to say the export sector seems to be gaining momentum. Steel production is pretty good. So that part of the various sectors we have talked about on the export side seems to be firing, which is helping India much more rapidly to regain momentum in terms of getting back on track. Domestic needs to be stepped up, and I think we covered about it. There's probably some kind of stimulus needed to stimulate demand on the demand side of the side. As far as the export hubs facing labor shortage, it is basically people are still reluctant to get out and go to remote places and work. They're still operating within the perimeter of safety first work environment rather than working in remote places. That's the consequence of these export hubs.
And growth in fiscal year 22 is projected to be around 11% in the economic survey, says the Chief Economic Advisor of India, KV Subramanian. A V-shaped recovery is on the anvil as far as business activity is concerned, and when business resumes in India, says Nomura. India's strong fundamentals and market size will continue to attract investments, says Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. FDI inflows rose 25.4 billion in 2020 from USD 25.4%, I should say, from USD 51 billion in 2019 to 64 billion in 2020. India is the fifth largest recipient in the world. Sir, there are two opinions about the FDI inflows. First, I'll let you have your say, and then I'll add what the second opinion is.
The FDI comprises of essentially three elements, and I think we have discussed this at length. One is around one which goes into the markets. Second, it goes by way of capital into various industries. And I think the third, that the money goes into investments in alternate investments, such as private equity and venture capital. India has been receiving significant amount of capital in the private equity and venture capital space. The FPI, foreign portfolio investments, has also seen a significant amount of growth. At a macro level, the story is the consequences of China and issues around China. China is still the number one recipient. There's a significant amount of money that is flowing into India as the emerging market sector allocation goes on the inflow of capital is concerned. That's just my view from a macro point of view when I look at the numbers at the high level.
So here's an alternate opinion on the FDI inflows. One of the opinions being trotted out is that if you look at the percentages of the FDI coming into India, 28% is coming from Mauritius, 26% from Singapore. The remaining is split across United States, UK, EU, Middle East, and so on and so forth. So people say that $1 in $2 is coming in, which is actually politicians' ill-gotten gains finding its way back to India, because India's politicians feel they can better protect their own investments in India than abroad, as so many changes are happening to taxations and tax havens and so on and so forth. Whatever it is, Indian politicians are patriotically corrupt. Let's put it that way and leave it at that point, and let's move on to the next news item. Union Home Minister Amit Shah on Monday lashed out at the opposition Congress Party and international organizations for suggesting that the government was involved in the surveillance of phones of politicians, journalists, and others, saying it was a report by disruptors for obstructors who want to derail India's development trajectory with their conspiracies. Ask sharper questions and allow government to answer these questions, Modi responds to opposition. A specter of disruption haunts the monsoon session as 26 bills are planned in 19 sessions. Yesterday it got off to a very rocky start. I believe that many of the new ministers were not even allowed to be introduced in the lower floor, Lok Sabha.
Well, yeah, I think that even Dr. Puri has come out and made a statement. There's several people who have come out and made a statement. See, what's going to happen is very similar to some of the models that we see in the United States. The bills are going to get through. You cannot stall a nation by hooliganism and by conducting these types of unwarranted, undemocratic method of engaging the other members of the parliament. They're elected members, so you have to engage. You don't stall. But this is the guerrilla democracy that has prevailed in many of the dysfunctional democracies. I think we saw another example of that, which is the Texas Democrats saw that they're willing to fly away and not be part of the session. Whereas in India, they're saying, we'll kind of make enough noise, and will not allow any proceedings, any business to be transacted. Not a very healthy business practice. You want to debate, put the issues on the table. You hear the pros, you hear the cons. That's the sign of a healthy, educated democracy. despite years and years, you see the same type of behavior coming through. Not very good. But India will get through. I mean, it's a large country. It has got through. It will get through, and things will move forward, sir.
India vaccinates 406.48 million doses as active cases slide to 421,665. The recoveries are at 30.308 million and deaths at 414,108. These are the COVID numbers. So your thoughts? I think India is stabilizing. Again, there are detractors who say that India is not counting them, it is undercounting. Be that as it may, at least on the surface it appears that things are coming back to normalcy. That's how I see it. So your thoughts?
No, I think that your observations are absolutely correct. I don't know why there is a overtly self-critical, which seems to be purely political rather than the reality of the data. Somehow, I didn't do it, so therefore it has to be bad. You did it, so if I had done it, it is good. Since you are doing it, it is bad. The fact is that 416 million doses is a remarkable number, given that where India was in various vaccinations programs in the past. Look at the world around and see for yourself. And then you answer the question whether you could have done 500 million, but the fact is it's still 406 million that has been given. And look at the asynchronous and asymmetrical methods. On one hand, the Supreme Court says, okay, a particular set of people cannot go, please block them. On the other side, they say for 3 days you open up the Pandora's box and everybody can go and mix. So this is the type of situation. There's still apparently close to 27 million vaccines available within states, some big number, okay? Whether it is 20 million, 18 million, a big number of vaccines left. They have not used it. If they're not using it, they may as well export it. Because I saw Nikkei saying India's variant 2 has caused hiccups in its vaccination diplomacy agenda. I tell Nikkei, no, India must take the vaccines that is not used by its state because it is unwilling, send it out to people who need it, because at least those people can be saved rather than the people who don't want to use it. So therefore, to me, that this is a very good outcome, 406 million. United States has not reached 400 million as yet. But as you rightly point out, the numbers, whether they are higher or smaller or lower, the vaccination program continues. And, one has to face the consequences of a pandemic. The world has faced the consequences of the pandemic, and India is no exception, where it is very densely populated.
And now let's take a look at United States news. Newly released US Labor Department data confirms that Republican governors are leading the way in Americans getting back to work. This is about Republican governors who continue to support the American work ethic. Jobs are rising and unemployment is lower in states with Republican governors and legislatures. 17 of the 20 states have Republican governors, and 18 of the 20 states that have Republican legislatures where jobs have recovered since the pandemic. So the overarching observation is that you have to open it as well as keep it under control where there is a higher incidence of the pandemic. That balance, those states that achieved it appears to have done better than the other states who have been saying close it, including California, sir.
Including New York. So therefore,
Yes.
Including New York. So the states that say you want to shut down and not people do it, you're not going to have any productive work, and you are going to see rising prices of the core items like the food. The food prices have risen enormously particularly in New York or some of the other states where you have a shutdown. And there's also logistics around the supply. But the key message is getting people back to work, giving them an incentive without compromising on the safety and security, following the due protocols that is warranted for COVID, seems to be the magic behind getting people back to work. That's the truth.
And sir, I'm seeing some strange kind of supply crunch situations, even basic things like nails, hooks, things that we take for granted, these things take a lot of time to procure. These days the way to shop is you go online and say, okay, I need this part, and then one place says I have so many in stock, but then when you go there they say, oh, no, 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 we don't have any in stock. Then you get redirected to another place. So simple things are taking a lot longer now. So in addition to things being priced higher, there's also supply chain constraints. I don't know how long it's going to be before this is going to be relieved, but America is really getting slowed down the way things are now happening as it tries to claw its way out of this pandemic. It's American taxpayers and not foreign investors who are on the line for Democrats' reckless spending, says a study on the 3.5 trillion budget proposal. This is basically people who are commenting on the infrastructure budget, isn't it? Infrastructure proposal.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, I think that is basically what they're saying is that, it's a very obvious truth, which is namely that when you look at capital gains, when you look at the estate taxes, when you look at the higher tax slabs, none of this relates to any overseas investors. They seem to be insulated. It's all domestic U.S. taxpayers who are facing the music to make sure that this massive deficit-based budget program is supported with U.S. investors and U.S. taxpayers funding these egregious costs.
An audit finds Trump cabinet official Wilbur Ross misled Congress over census citizenship question. So what is this thing about? Wilbur Ross was in Trump administration towards the latter part of his administration, isn't it?
I think there was a census conducted. There was a question which is supposed to say, are you a U.S. citizen? You remember the whole issue around the census was to be restricted only to U.S. citizens, not to all the other people who, for example, DACA program. People are supposed to be counted until the courts passed a different verdict. They were supposed to be, as part of the Obama administration, the DACA program was introduced. So they were supposed to have been counted. So in his briefings, he seems to have said, there was no question in conducting the census that the citizenship question was asked. So twice they found out that he has misled in his briefings to the House. So that audit report has come out.
And the number of Texas Democrats who fled Texas testing are testing positive now. That number has risen to 5. So they all came in the same plane. So there were about 60 of them. So who knows how many of them are infected. An Arizona election audit will show Trump won the election in 2020 and that the majority of Republicans believe in it, the polls will show. Judge rebuffs voter rights activists' move to block Georgia election law. Sir, this is now gathering momentum as more and more states are auditing what happened in the 2020 elections. And you said yesterday that when people looked at the Arizona count, especially in the Maricopa County, they could not find matching slips, documentation to justify the number of votes that candidates support. So this is a black and white situation. You got to have, if there's a vote, you have to have a matching slip that says that this is the person that voted. I mean, if you do a name comparison, I'm assuming at this point that this is all being done manually. So there has to be a match. How can Democrats still say, I'm reading in CNN some nonsense, sir, that they say that Republicans continue to drum up that this is fake. But for God's sake, show us that there is a corresponding manual entry of the vote. People have double counted.
So, I think simple truth is, today media is very clear, which is namely that I believe truth the way I see it. That's one side of the fence. Then I believe in false to be the truth is the other side of it. Or I believe in truth the way I see it. So you have two sides. So there is no, the center has gone in United States. So you get two versions. And the fact of the matter is that the elections were a hodgepodge process in the 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 battleground states. That is the truth, the hodgepodge process. unless and until there's an objective audit and objective, independent, unbiased mechanism is used, one will not, get to the bottom of it. But suffice to say, we have a problem. And I think we have covered and you have articulated in many ways that India is electronic. Why United States? The reason why India and US is brought is one is the largest democracy, the other is the oldest democracy. These are the two, at least, dysfunctionally functioning democracies, right? They're dysfunctional, but at least dysfunctionally functioning democracies. You said there has to be a change in the processes and systems. That's one part of it. The second part of it is you have a fundamental disconnect whether illegal should be allowed to vote, whether DACA people should be allowed to vote, whether voter ID should be used to vote. So then you get into this whole constitutional question, right, where there is a fundamental misalignment between the two parties. So what we are witnessing is the vagary of the system in the oldest democracy, which is supposed to be a democracy, where constitutional principles have been set aside or cast aside. And by the way, many of these judgments come one way or the other way, depending on who was the judge and who appointed the judge. In the case of Georgia, the appointee is basically a Trump appointee, who has basically said, hey, the law is in place. All the things that you are talking about is enacted and passed as a law. It is too late for you to come back. It's a law. So therefore, move on. Then you go to Arkansas, where the appointee is either Obama or Clinton period, where for the similar set of data, you have a very different opinion. So this is what you are seeing, which is namely, depending on which side of the political fence, you are getting this varying or inconsistent opinions, which is making all these things, though black and white, in terms of no disrespect, is being misinterpreted, and this vagary will continue. And it is going, we are 2022 elections is not too far. 2022 elections is not too far. And this is going to be very momentous and decisive, where both Senate and House could flip, they go the opposite way, as typically happens in this post the presidential elections. So interesting times ahead, Sriji.
What really blows my mind, sir, is the denial some of the media sites are continuing to do, when you can see on social media, on your own channels, people reinserting and rescanning a ballot that was already scanned. It goes out of the scanner, comes back in, there is no cutaway, I don't see any cut there to try and say, oh, they just cut and pasted it to make it look like it is very black and white. It's very easy to see how this is being done. I don't know why these results are not brought out in the public and show that, okay, this particular vote happened 3 times and it was counted 3 times or 2 times, and that essentially should be invalidated. You can only have 1 time count of a vote. This is all plain black and white common sense, and still people continue to be in denial. It's really, really strange. CDC says to avoid travel to the United Kingdom as COVID cases rise there. Extremely frustrating. New York Democrat rips Biden's hesitation to open Canadian border. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends masks in schools for everyone, vaccinated or not. Biden says inflation is temporary and urges more Americans to get vaccinated. US transfers Guantanamo Bay prisoners to Morocco. The population now drops to 39. So I'm running through a little bit here, but the point I think is that even if schools reopen, I think masks are mandatory, at least until there is a clear control over this new variant. And for God's sake, we have to stop this Wuhan lab. It has to be completely sealed, and nothing should be allowed to come out, because there are so many theories that are floating. Nobody has refuted them as to how you can freeze dry the virus, take it to a new place, and then set it open, and within minutes it will start spreading. That's how they say that the Delta virus spread in the Dharavi slum in Mumbai.
I think that we're not going to get to your observations are correct, but I don't think we're going to accomplish that goal. Basically, it has become a strategic bioweapon for the Chinese in terms of deployment at will, location, time of their choice, to create enough disruption. So I just don't know whether this is going to. I think we're going to have this COVID going on probably all of 2021, well into 2022, before some nirvana occurs and something changes. But otherwise, I just heard yesterday a WHO official saying it'll be a miracle to assume that this will be controlled by mid 2022 or even late 2022. So, as you say, I think we have to live with this. And I hope the disruptions. I mean, UK travel ban is quite bad, but the thing is rising and in growing in many countries. You can see what's happened to Southeast Asia.
And reminiscent of Obama administration, cyber attackers continue to ignore Biden red lines. Sir, one simple thing, even if Biden says don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it is now the workforce is spread across the country. Many companies have people working from their homes, and you can tell the central administration can say, okay, don't do this, install this software, install this. But there is always inertia, sir. You and I know every day, even though we do this repeat 207th time we are doing it today, every day when we prep for it, there's always a surprise. So what people do is try to avoid surprises. And how do you avoid surprises? Don't install new software.
Yeah. So I think the this red line about Obama and the cyber attacks is self-control in terms of what you pointed out, software enhancements and other things, and other types of forensic screening that needs to happen to make sure that you have. That's one facet. The second facet is that I think the U.S. administration has perhaps woken up too late. It doesn't have combative or remedial measures in place to mitigate any type of these attacks. That is why there is a tremendous amount of frustration. So Biden would be well advised not to issue red lines like his predecessor, his mentor, Mr. Obama, but to say, look, we are working towards trying to solve this problem. And there's how much, whatever he wants to say, his political advisors can state, but there is no combative remedial measures in place to repel. That is why these people are acting at will.
And Education Secretary Miguel Cardona retreats from making critical race theory part of the new school grants. I think that is a welcome move. You should not thrust anything down anyone's throat. And CRT is extremely controversial. In fact, if you ask me, sir, the members of the progressives should start practicing Maun Vrat. It will make them better human beings.
Yeah.
So, sir, let's take a quick look at markets now as we start winding down today's process. And the official body tasked with declaring recessions, the National Bureau of Economic Research, on Monday stated that the US recession ended in April 2020. That means it started sometime in probably February 2020 and then it ended in April 2020. This is one of the fastest recoveries that I can think of, sir, and all this thanks to President Trump and his timely stimulus. The recovery was very swift. So just let's take a quick look at this. We are about 38 minutes into the broadcast now, but maybe 1 minute on why this is not being played up in the news today.
It's not being played up. First and foremost, by the way, we have shared these graphs in two. One is a fireside chat where we showed three important data points. One is the dip V in terms of the markets. Two, we showed the recovery of retail purchases, how within 2 quarters we achieved the retail purchases. Three, we showed the unemployment data, which went to about 14.2%, and how, again, by end of the year, it had tapered down to about 7.2 or 7.9%. No doubt, 3.5, 3.6 was pre-pandemic unemployment, but when it went to 14.2, we pointed out, and this was, the reason was unheard of, and this is the first time they put this big, almost 10% of GDP stimulus in one tranche directed at 4 specific segments. One is direct payments to people. Two, the PPP program, which was directed at small business. And 3 was the corporates and mid corporates being supported, and 4th, from a credit point of view, the Fed coming into the way and the asset purchase program. We pointed this out and said these integrated programs help to get the business back on track. By the time we got to the third quarter of 2020, we presented this data. Why Trump is not being? Because he's Trump. Because Trump is unilaterally, hated by the media. So therefore, nothing, be it for vaccines, be it for any other program, the wall, the vaccines, the more stringent position around the world, around the law and order, and then the economic management that occurred, you will not find anybody. And you can now see for yourself on all these 4 dimensions, we have massive issues in United States. But this is economic point that we are trying to make. We have shared all these data, and we even shared this data in the fireside chats that we conducted where we walked through the budgets and how the stimulus helped to recover. Of course, there were problems in programs, but it did not mitigate the recovery to occur, and you can see even in the stock markets.
And the Dow tumbles more than 700 points on COVID rebound and concerns around global growth. Investors are struggling to calibrate a strong recovery against rising prices and a resurgent COVID infections and uncertainty over global economic rebound. So, what are the markets telling us today? Yesterday, it was a drop of 700 plus points.
It's telling us that they are as emotional and volatile, and that is why you have the volatility index going like a yo-yo. As COVID cases rise and more news comes out and more active cases are reported from United States, there's a sudden fear, and more active cases reported from, let's say, Southeast Asia, which is right now with Olympics being the hub of the attention. And then you have a travel ban into Europe. UK, or travel restrictions into UK, if I correct myself, you find that there's a sudden fear. So they're reacting to the sentiments on that day. Today they say, okay, this is fine. We dealt with it and we go on. So you'll find that within the next 3-4 days, the markets, coming back. Sometimes people also, you can see these gyrations. Some traders take profits because, the markets are at all-time highs. Then you see the sudden kind of dips, and then things coming back to. So 2021, as I mentioned, we will find that the markets will be, because as vaccination drives increase, and even the variants take time to creep into some of the countries such as United States, you will find that the markets will be reasonably fine, and we are already all-time highs. But I think the real challenge is going to be how we are going to get out of this COVID and COVID variant, how we are going to move into 2022. I think that's where the real problem is going to come. Can we regain employment? Can we get more people back to work? Can we see, without stimulus, the economy rebounding? Why there is a 6-7.5% growth this year, 6 to 7% growth this year, and why is it going to taper out to 3? Is there normalization possible? Some of the questions that you have posed. There's a supply chain issues. Why certain products are not available? Has import substitution occurred because we want to ban many items from China? So these are all the questions for which there is no detailed answers available until you see. We even covered many large retailers in anticipation of asymmetric demand, trying to store up their warehouses and regulate the supply of items so that they can manage the demand in a much more organized manner. If you're shopping in, for example, in Amazon Fresh and you ask for 6 cartons of milk, you will not get 6 cartons of milk. You will get 3 to 4 cartons of milk. If you ask for 4 or 5 packets of butter, you may get 3 to 4 packets of butter. This is an example of how, using an algorithmic model, the retailers are trying to manage so that you don't have a situation of major supply one day, no supply another day.
Absolutely, and we are seeing it firsthand in California too. With that, our today's hangout comes to a close. We'll be back again tomorrow, bright and early. Thanks for joining. Do click on the bell button and subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much, Sridharji, and namaskar.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.